For more on drug pricing and Mr. Trump's plan to reduce them, earlier I spoke with Kate Tulenko, CEO of global health firm Corvus Health. She began by explaining why there aren't more biosimilars currently on the market.
Biosimilars are very complex to create because the biologicals are complex to create, and they have to be created via cell culture. So a bacteria or a human cell culture is producing them. And so that's one reason. They're just complex in themselves. And also, it's very difficult to do the clinical trials to prove that a biosimilar has the same action as the original brand biologic. And another potential barrier is that some of the companies, understandably, don't provide samples to generic companies so they can reverse engineer the biologic and create the biosimilars.
But there's also been an incentive as well for the drug companies. They wanted a waiting period for these biosimilars.
Absolutely, because as long as a drug stays on brand and on patent, they can certainly make more money that way, absolutely.
So now this is opening up, according to FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb's plan. How will this look? Do you have any idea?
Well, I think we can see a few things. You will, of course, see some pushback from the industry, but I think, you know, if the FDA is quite serious about this, it will proceed forward. And I think we can see in a few years more biosimilars appearing, but it will take a number of years just because these processes are so complex.
Because they have to go through their own set of clinical trials.
Exactly, exactly.
So Scott Gottlieb tweeted, actually, we're committed to advancing policies to facilitate efficient development, approval of biosimilars to reduce costs, enhance access without reducing incentives to innovate. Hashtag BAP, his plan, will advance these goals. Judging from that tweet right there, what is this about? Is this about reducing the cost, or is it about making access to those who need these drugs?
I think it's about both, because as you reduce costs, you increase access. It's also interesting to note that he mentions innovation. The majority of new drugs developed every year are actually developed in the U.S. and often with federal funding. And this is one of the reasons why this whole issue is very controversial, because the U.S. consumer pays more for their drugs than any other consumer in the world, yet drugs are developed in the U.S.
Absolutely. And, you know, I just wanted to talk about some of the facts regarding the drug industry. Many people may not realize that 9 out of 10 times a drug fails before it gets to market. And it can cost upwards of $1 billion to bring one of these drugs to market. And when you consider the rising cost, let's say, of Alzheimer's, which is on track to be that as rivaling the Defense Department budget by the year 2050. When you consider that kind of cost and the fact that it takes $1 billion to innovate and get the investment and bring a drug to market, explain for our audience why the drug companies push back against lowering prices.
Right. So, for example, when you pay for a drug, you're not just paying for the manufacture of that drug, and you're not just paying for the development of that drug, but you're paying for the development of the 9 other failed medicines that never made it past clinical trials. And so that is the reason that drugs can be so expensive.
80% of the drugs that are dispensed basically in the United States when you go to the pharmacy are actually generic drugs. The rest of them, specialty drugs, and that's where the costs come in.
Right, exactly.
But the generic prices are rising as well.
Like, for example, we've seen the EpiPen, the price increase dramatically. And I think that's one thing that Trump's new plan hopes to be able to address. So, for example, in advertising, that the companies will need to put the list price of the drug there. And, you know, some of the price increase may be an attempt to recoup on development costs. It's hard to say necessarily why the prices increase.
So 60% of the drugs that are developed for worldwide use are developed right here in the United States. But then again, you have to also consider there is no government regulation, and the pharmaceutical companies, they deem what the price of the drug is. Is that fair?
I mean, it depends. For example, with the new hepatitis C drug, it's estimated that they priced it at just below the lifetime cost of caring for someone with hepatitis C. And, you know, so you would save money by treating someone, but also, you know, not very much. You know, it's very difficult to come up with necessarily a fair rule that would apply to all drugs on how to do the pricing. But certainly you would expect, if a drug were generic, were all off patent, that the prices would fall as competition comes in, you know, as more companies produce the drug.
I mean, there are some facts out there that like 90% of pharmaceutical companies do not even make a profit. That's hard to believe when you hear about how expensive drugs are. 90% of the drug development programs fail. Most people do know that fact. And also, when you look at how the pharmaceutical industry rates compared to other industries, let's say even media, the tobacco industry, the car industry, restaurant, hospitality, it ranks 36 on the list. How is that possible when some of the specialty drugs, let's say for Hep C, cancer, are so expensive?
Yeah, well, it's because each company is producing different drugs. And for example, the current diabetes drug, which is one of the most prescribed drugs, brand drugs in the world, they're making an enormous profit, whereas other companies are either just breaking even or going out of business. And it's very difficult to come up with a rule of thumb to do the pricing. And I think that this would be less of an issue if most Americans could afford their medications, whereas right now 3 out of 4 Americans say they're having trouble affording their medications.
Without these researchers and these scientists developing and the money invested in this, we can't move forward. But at the same time, for many people out there, 3 out of 4 people in the United States, it's unaffordable.
Right. So as you say, these are modern miracles, the vaccines and the drugs. And the question is how to make sure that the industry can be properly rewarded, that there can be an incentive for creating new drugs, but that the American people can get the drugs and vaccines they need at an affordable cost. And hopefully the new plan will take a step towards that.